If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what are some eerie, supernatural things you've seen out there? But no one believes you when you tell them. The Owl Man. My friend and I, when we were younger, were having a sleepover, laying on the couches in my living room. I was situated underneath a big bay window, and my friend was perpendicular to me on the other couch. As we were watching a movie, we began to hear rustling in the bushes and animalistic moving noises outside the bay window, so we turned the volume down and stared at the window in fear for a few seconds. Suddenly, a huge figure reared up and slammed itself face first onto the window, arms splayed out. This thing was the size of a large man, had huge wings that blocked out the light from the streetlight outside, and had the most terrifying, massive, almost glowing yellow eyes. They had to have been the size of baseballs, or at least that's what my brain definitely remembers them being. It stayed there too, not as if a bird hit the window and bounced off. I'm not sure how long it went, past a second or two, as my friend and I ran screaming and sobbing out of the room into my parents' room. My dad, probably not even sure what exactly we were screaming about, grabbed a bat and set off outside, but came back in with nothing to report. The image is still burned into my brain, and even to this day, I find it hard to look out of windows at night or to be alone outside at night. My friend still remembers this encounter clearly too, as I asked her about it a few years ago. What makes this even more wild is my stumbling across a terrifying discovery many years later as an adult. There has been a string of Mothman/Owlman/winged humanoid sightings around my area for many years, with I'm guessing over 100 other testimonies of a creature just like the one I saw. I actually had a talk with a man who is running a database of testimonies and research on this thing and had my testimony taken to be added with all the others. My encounter dates back further than most and definitely many years before I've even heard of anything else like this. It's so damn hard to tell this story as it's incredibly unbelievable, and most people would just brush it off as two kids getting scared by an owl flying into a window. Hell, I even almost catch myself wondering if I made it all up in my head sometimes, were I not to have a witness who remembers the events exactly as I do. But I know what I saw. When I was just 2 or 3 years old, I remember playing outside in the backyard with my grandpa. We owned a huge, empty field. I remember seeing a huge white rabbit, think Alice in Wonderland, hopping around, human-sized, maybe 20 feet away from me. I started running towards it, looked back to my grandpa, looked back to the rabbit, and it was gone. Crazy dream, huh? My grandpa passed away a few years later. We had to move because we could no longer afford the rent. I raised my grandparents. We were looking at the house that we ended up buying, which had 7 acres of woods, a long driveway, and a big yard that was a field. Walking down the big driveway, I heard a rustle in a bush. I thought it was a deer, and I looked out of excitement. It was the same rabbit, immediate déjà vu. Nobody else saw it, but they heard it. About 6 years later, we moved again. I remember looking out the window around Easter time and seeing this rabbit yet again. Nobody else has ever seen it, but my grandma can confirm I've talked about it for as long as I could talk. Toddler me saw something that nobody else has. I don't believe in the spiritual or anything, but I saw something, and I'd love an explanation one day. I swear on everything that matters to me, I saw a goddamn 5-foot-tall rabbit 3 times in my life. When I was a kid, around 9, I was on my grandfather's farm, which was massive. It stretched for acres and acres. I went off exploring one day with my house, and I came across this massive ditch. It used to be a lake before it was drained and dried up. I fell into this ditch and hit everything on the way down. I ended up breaking my leg. So I'm at the bottom of this ditch, and I'm screaming for help, hoping someone will bear with me. And I swear to God. I look up, and I see this red-headed girl staring down at me. She doesn't say anything, but she's just looking at me. I start calling to get her attention, and she just takes off and leaves me. Hours later, my grandfather would find me when he came looking because my horse was wandering around the area. And to this day, I can't explain who this girl was or where she came from. 17 years later, and I still don't know. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, I had an otherworldly experience. So I was getting ready for sleep, and as I laid down, my entire body went stiff. I couldn't move as much as I tried, often known as sleep paralysis. Believe it or not, sleep paralysis isn't too uncommon. You can actually see someone in that state on YouTube. Anyway, the weirdness had just begun. Fast forward a few minutes later, and my body is floating above my bed. I tried to scream for my dad, but I couldn't speak. My body floats down the stairs and into the living room. I was able to feel the carpet under my palms and the hardness of the floor on my back. It was very dark, but I could clearly see my entire living room. I was fully aware of my surroundings, despite the fact that I was indeed awake. In a split second, I was in bed again. The trip down to the living room was kind of slow, but the trip back to my bed was instant. I was still in a state of sleep paralysis for another 5 minutes, maybe. I slowly broke out of it and let out a pretty loud yelp. My dad came into my room, asking what was wrong. I explained what happened. The odd thing was that he seemed assured by the whole situation. Not surprised or concerned in the least bit. The next day, I tried to talk to my dad about it, and he told me a story about my grandma. My dad said that when he was a teenager, he walked into my grandmother's bedroom, and she was literally levitating above her bed. To this day, everyone to whom I tell my story just assumes I was dreaming. This was no dream. Honestly, I don't even know what I saw. I was around 8 or 9 and was at my grandma's house when we were told we couldn't go outside until they told us to. I got bored and snuck out, and a cousin of mine followed me. At the time, I didn't know why they told us that since it wasn't raining and it was a pretty nice day out, but I still went out. My grandma lives near a beach in Puerto Rico, so her property has sand, and while walking, I saw these strange-looking animal tracks. My cousin said it's probably the herd of goats that pass by. From what I can remember about the tracks, they were as long or even bigger than my footprints, and they didn't look like they were made by goats. Being curious, I followed where they were leading when I heard something in front of me like a hiss. I looked and saw something hiding behind a palm tree just peeking out, and it was looking at me. I remember it having a really dark color with red eyes. We were about 10 feet apart, and I could hear it breathing. I could even smell it, and it stunk like some animal was rotting. I yelled at my cousin to run into the house, and we both ran and made it, but when I turned around, whatever that thing was gone. Unfortunately, my cousin didn't see it but knew I wasn't lying since he said my face went pale and I looked terrified. No one believed me, and when I go to my grandma's house, I avoid that place because I see it religiously. I still have no clue what it was or if I even imagined it. I did find out later that the reason they told us not to go outside to play was because the neighbor had 2 of his pigs stolen, and the ones who stole them could be hiding somewhere. My parents live in South Louisiana, and they have this screened-in pool. Then their yard backs up to the woods. I was sitting out by the pool around 2 a.m. smoking when I saw this big black dog in the woods. It looked like a wolf, but there aren't any wolves in the area. I turned on my phone flashlight and walked to the edge of the screen. I felt pretty safe because there was a barrier between me and this giant black dog. I then went to the door that leads to the yard, opened it a little, and yelled, "Shoo, go away." The dog backed into the woods. And I could see its eyes reflecting on my flashlight. Then the eyes disappeared, and 2 seconds later, my flashlight reflected off another set of eyes, but they were much higher, like those of a man. Then the man started walking towards me. I couldn't see him because it was dark and he was behind some trees. I just heard him coming closer. I got back into the screened-in pool, locked the door, and hauled my ass inside. I woke up my dad and told him there was a man in our backyard. He grabbed his hunting rifle and went outside. No one was there. My dad told me I must have been dreaming. I wasn't dreaming, I know what I saw. Maybe it was just some creepy guy stalking our house from the woods with his giant monster dog. When I was about 10 or 11, we were having a get-together at my grandma's house for the holidays. All of us cousins played all day, and when night fell, we played hide and seek. While the adults smoked and drank up by the house, we stayed on the back of the property, just having a good time. I was hiding in between a bush and the property fence when I heard the strangest sound. It was almost a scream, both happy and miserable at the same time. I jumped up and kind of shouted. All my cousins heard it, and we all saw it, too. It was an animal on 2 legs, and it ran off with really jerky motions. Being the oldest by about 3 years, I calmed down the crying little ones and explained as best I could that it was just someone trying to scare us. I've had nightmares about that sound. In my mind, it seems like a grotesque mimicry of our joyous screams and laughter as we played. None of my cousins today will admit to even remembering the incident, although the adults remember the commotion it caused. I was camping in Michigan's Upper Peninsula at J.W. Wells State Park. It was late, around midnight. The kids were in a giant tent, there were 9 of us. Adults were out drinking at the campfire. Suddenly, there were headlights shining into our camp. A ranger pulled up and rushed over to speak to the adults in whispered, frantic tones. Not 2 minutes later, our parents were scrabbling to get us out of the tent. We all piled into the van, scared. My mom explains that there is a family of wolverines in the campground that are aggravated over something, so the rangers want everyone in vehicles. We have been giggling and screwing around in the van for an hour when we hear this bone-chilling, cackle-like scream. It was loud. We all shut right up and are staring at each other, and I'm wondering if a wolverine really makes that sound when. Our tent, which we were just in, was ripped apart, and we watched as something collapsed it and was thrashing around for what seemed like forever. All we had was the light of the campfire and myself and my 2 cousins staring hard into the darkness behind the van, trying to make out this wolverine tearing up our canvas tent. It went still, and my dad and drunk uncle ran to the tent, beating it with sticks. They didn't find anything. No animal, no nothing. The scream came again as they were kicking through the remains in the woods behind the van. My uncle pointed his giant craftsman flashlight immediately in that direction, and something furry standing on 2 legs took off running, howling, screaming, and cackling as it went, hooking its weirdly angled arms above its head. I saw the flashlight shine in its eyes, and that was no ducking bear. We slept in our cars and left as soon as the sun was up. We left the shredded canvas tent behind, and my mom snapped a picture. I'll ask her for it next time I talk to her, if anyone is interested. The ranger refunded our week plus the night we stayed and gave us a truck bed full of firewood. I think the adults knew it wasn't a wolverine. When I was 5, I woke up from my sleep and saw a man sitting on the stairs, watching me. I wasn't scared, though. There was something tranquil about it. I just watched him, and he watched me for what seemed like 10 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, he was gone. A few days later, I found out my dad had been killed in Europe. I live in Canada, and my parents were separated. There are pictures of me with him when I was just born, but he left shortly after that. To this day, that is the only memory that I have of my dad. A ghost watching over me. I don't believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw. I've never told anyone before except my mom. In 1994, on a farm in the southern Midwest US, 5-year-old me had this huge yellow lab, the sweetest dog in the world, who one day suddenly lost her SHT barking and ran outside. Being 5, I followed her and watched her run out into the cow pasture, where the cows were suspiciously nowhere in sight, and went toe-to-toe with a ducking gray wolf. That area at that time was definitely not wolf country. Coyote sure, but there is no way it was a coyote. Thing towered over my lab, and I'd seen plenty of coyotes before to know that this thing was not that. My lab barked her damn head off right in his face, and after about a minute, he tilted his head and then just turned around and disappeared into the woods. All the cows at the opposite end of the pasture circled around the 2 calves we had. They were never that terrified of coyotes, and they had no fear of domestic dogs. My lab literally climbed over them when they laid down and would tug on their tails. Cows gave no ducks. I will go to my damn grave and say it was a wolf I saw, but nobody believes me, of course. I've spent years researching wolves and wolf hybrids, but every picture I've seen of both the animal and the paw prints he left behind says it was very, very much more wolf than coyote, dog, or even a mix. When I was in college, I lived in a 3-story repurposed frat house that had a really big field in the back. There was a couple on the same floor as me, and they were expecting. One night, I woke up to what sounded like a baby crying. My first thought was, damn, she's already had the baby. As I came closer, I realized the sound was coming from outside, and it wasn't a baby. It was something different. I looked out my window to see 5 of the most gorgeous animals I've ever seen in my life. They looked like foxes, and they were just walking around the field. Seriously, the most beautiful sight I've ever seen. The strange thing about this is that I cannot, for the life of me, find any animals that look like the ones I saw. They were silvery white. Gorgeous color. They stood about as tall as a Great Dane but were much skinnier. Super lean body on top of long, skinny legs. They seemed light on their feet and kind of trotted with their walk. Their faces looked like those of the fennec fox, but these guys were much bigger than a fennec. Their ears were the same proportion as a fennec's, though. So imagine a couple of satellite dishes for ears. Their tails were their most prominent feature. They were super fluffy, like a snow fox's tail, and they stood straight up in the air, and I mean straight up. Their tails didn't move, even when they were walking. After a couple minutes of watching, I was frozen in wonder. It was like 3 a.m. What was I supposed to do? Go wake people up to see these foxes? They made some loud calls, and they all darted in one direction diagonally to my window until they were out of sight. I've scoured the internet looking for a breed of coyote or fox that looks like the ones I saw. But I've found nothing. I write this still in hopes that someone can produce an image of an animal that looks like what I saw. I was in Cullowhee, North Carolina, when this happened. I think I saw a gnome. I was with my little sister at the time. I was about 12, and she was 10. It was late, and we were running home from our friend's house. In front of our house was a jacuzzi that was never really plugged in, it was just there. Anyway, we made it home, but right before we went inside, we heard 3 distinct voices. They spoke a language we did not understand. I guess they didn't hear us coming, we heard their frightened voices. There were 3 in all, from what I heard. 2 higher pitches and a deeper pitch. If anyone has seen Shrek 4 Ever After, there was this little boy that said "do the roar." Their voices sounded familiar. We saw from the corner of our eyes that they were walking on the side of the jacuzzi. They were about 1 foot 5 inches tall from what we could tell. They jumped from the jacuzzi and ran while hurrying up one another. Me and my sister heard and saw the whole thing, and we told our mom when we came running home. She said it was all in our heads, but I know what I and my sister saw that day. It was 2 days before Halloween 2006. My dad was bringing me out to buy a costume to wear. It was raining pretty hard, and it was nearly dark. As we were pulling out of our driveway, I saw a lady walking down the sidewalk. It wasn't an ordinary person. She was glowing bright white from head to toe and seemed like she was emitting light. She was dressed in a puffy Victorian-era dress, or maybe a wedding dress, and carrying an umbrella that was also glowing white. As my dad was driving off, I asked, "Do you see that?" And he looked in his side view mirror and said, "Yeah, what is that?" Stunned as much as I was. After driving a few hundred feet, he decides to make a U-turn to check it out, but the ghostly white lady is nowhere to be found. A friend and I were camping on some property my family owns. We were hanging out by a fire when we heard a little rustle behind us. I turn around with my flashlight and shine it in the direction I heard the noise. My flashlight briefly caught an eye. Now, I've spent countless days in this area, in the woods. I've seen bears, cougars, deer, fisher cats, raccoons, and anything else that lives there. The eye shine caught me off guard, as I didn't recognize it. I wrote it off as a raccoon due to the height of the eyes, assuming it was a coon in a tree. Within a few minutes, we heard a twig snap, this time closer. A dog hides in a tent, whimpering. It's not a tough dog. No big deal, it's just an animal. All of a sudden, I have to poop. I found a tree just out of sight of camp where I could still see the light from the fire. As I'm finishing up, I hear a loud bang. I lean to the side to see around a small tree as I'm whipping, and I see my bud standing up and staring in the direction of our van. His flashlight was on the ground, lit. I've cleaned myself enough, so I jump up and jog over to him. His mouth is open, and he just starts to point at the Aerostar van we came in. On top of it is a giant ducking dude, 7 feet or so, with long asses gripped around it. With his feet tucked under him in a squat-like position. He is just sitting there, shaking the van back and forth. I could see the suspension collapsing under his weight, and the van made a large squeaking noise as he rocked it back and forth. I slowly leaned down to grab my buddy's flashlight, and as I brought it up, the thing looked over at us. I got the flashlight up to his ankles before it leapt off the van in our opposite direction and made off into the woods with loud crashes. My friend requested that we leave. It's so strange, I can hardly believe it happened. This happened just the other day. I recently got a new R, and I haven't gotten to shoot it much or sight it in. I also got a 60-round drum, which I had been dying to test out and see how it works. I live in Kentucky, and I'm a bit in the country, so I have plenty of land to shoot on and don't have to drive to a range. I grab my gun and a little bit of ammo and start walking. After about 10 steps into the forest, I got an extremely strange feeling, like I was being watched or followed. I ignored it and moved on. The further I moved, though, the worse it got. The magazine to my gun was unloaded, and the feeling of being watched got so bad that I actually stopped and quickly loaded 20 rounds into the magazine. As I was loading it, I started smelling something and hearing flies. I turned around, and there was a somewhat fresh-looking dead rabbit. The feeling of being watched was now unbearable, so I loaded the magazine in my gun and kept the bolt held open so I could quickly put a round in. As I'm walking along a creek, I hear a big splash that spooks me, and as I look over, I see something I have never seen before and hope I never see again. It was about 7 to 8 feet tall, super skinny, and walking on its hind legs. It was about the color of a deer, too. To give you guys an idea of how skinny it was, I told my friend, who weighs around 120 pounds, to imagine himself at 8 feet tall. I never got a look at its head, but I was so shocked by what I saw that I could barely move. All I heard was the splash, it moved along the bank of the creek, and it disappeared. I never heard noise from that direction again. I tried to load a round into the chamber of my gun, but of course it jammed up and didn't want to work correctly, which could have very easily gotten me killed. I've contacted the company and told them I want my money back or a replacement that will actually work. As for what I saw, I have no idea. I'm not sure if I imagined it, actually saw it, or what. I say this because I never heard noise from that area again, and something that big has to make noise roaming through brush and weeds. But I'm certain I saw something. I have talked to my friends about it, and they have suggested it may have been a Wendigo. As for the proof, I didn't quite feel like going down to an isolated creek where I couldn't get out with an unknown creature to find tracks, hair, or anything else for that matter. Normally, I don't spook very easily, but I have been on edge for about a week because of this. I just don't know what I'm supposed to do if I actually see something out there. I had heard of Wendigos before, but I never actually thought I would see one. What scares me even more is that about 3 years ago, a good friend who lives only about 2 miles from me said he saw a Wendigo at his house too. My freshman year of college, 2011, I was driving from Minnesota to Colorado for spring break with 2 friends. I landed the night shift of driving. About 3/4 of the way through Nebraska, at about 2 a.m., I started to pull up behind a white hearse. I got in the left lane to pass it. When I looked at the back, I noticed the bumper said "We clown around so the kids don't frown," and it had polka dot curtains. As I passed it, already freaked out because it was clearly a murder clown hearse, I accidentally made eye contact with the driver. He was an older guy with gray, sagging skin, and dead eyes. It feels like we stared at each other for minutes, even though it was probably just a few seconds. I slapped my friend next to me awake. He looked over and freaked out and started yelling, "Drive! Get the duck out here!" No one can convince me there weren't dead kids in the back of that hearse. I live in Florida, and our deer here are ducking tiny, like the size of a Labrador retriever. I grew up in Ohio, where the deer are just slightly smaller than a horse. So I was driving down I-95 a year or so ago, somewhere between Melbourne and Jensen Beach. It's early night, the sun just went down, and now it's very dark, with surprisingly few cars on the road. I'm seeing tons of deer along the side of the road, grazing. This is pretty common, they're out all the time. About every half mile, I see another cluster of them, pricking their heads up as I drive by. All of a sudden I come across this cluster of maybe 10 to 15 deer, and they are standing around this thing. It was beautiful, whatever it was. It looked like the bastard love child of a deer and an alpaca, with a shaggy mane and a long neck, but it had antlers and a face like a deer. Its fur was white, but not like a pure magical unicorn white, but more like a light sandy white, almost tan. And it was huge. Like elk-sized. These little deer standing around it didn't even come up to its belly. It was striking next to the small deer, but it didn't look like some kind of majestic, magical forest creature or anything. This isn't a Miyazaki movie. It looked like a normal animal, just not one I've ever seen or knew how to identify, and that's saying something. I'm an animal and wildlife nut who can identify just about everything I see in the wild. This thing? I've never seen it in my life. Not in books, not on TV, nothing. I can still picture it perfectly in my head, standing just off the side of the road. Around 2 years ago, I started seeing a faceless black figure looking up at me. I was in my school's bathroom when I first saw it. I had just finished using the bathroom, and I looked into the mirror while washing my hands. I saw the black figure behind me, turned around, and boom, nothing was there. I was sort of creeped out and went back to my classroom. Fast forward 2 days later, and I'm back in that classroom. I look out the window and see the same figure staring up at me. I went to the nurse and said, my stomach was hurting, but my mom made me stay in school. I went down to the nurse for probably 3/4 of the day for the next 2 weeks, seeing the figure almost every day. I eventually confessed to my mom what was happening, and I started going to therapy. After about 4 months of therapy, I still saw it but knew it wasn't real and didn't freak out. I still see this figure a few times a week, but I don't get scared anymore. The worst part is that most people think I made up the whole thing. We never figured out why I saw this figure other than it might have been anxiety related. When I was in high school, my youth group went camping. The girls were staying in an 8-person tent with the female youth pastor, and I was lying down looking at the door. There were 2 girls between me and the entrance. Our youth pastor, who, looking back, was only maybe 3 or 4 years older than me, walks in, and I turn my head to look up at her. Now it was dark, and most everything was kind of in silhouette, but if you were within 10 feet or so of someone, you could make out features after your eyes adjusted for a second. I could make out the features on the girl behind my youth pastor, so naturally, my eyes tried to adjust and create some dimension when I focused on my youth leader. Anyway, my eyes settle in, and I realize she has no features. Just a solid black shadow. Oh, and the solid black shadow of my youth pastor, is swinging from a noose. I look down, and I see light between the shadow and the ground. Like feet off the ground, gently swinging from the neck. At first I just gaped like a fish, and then finally I screamed. Just the loudest, most horrified scream I've ever let out. Ducking horror movie scream, she says my name and turns to face me, and suddenly it's her. I can make out her features immediately, and she's looking at me, terrified. She and the other girls started praying over me, and my best friend assured me my eyes were just playing tricks on me. I don't believe in Jesus anymore, but I sure as shit believe I saw the shadow of a swinging corpse in the middle of the woods with my high school youth group. I grew up in rural East Tennessee and western North Carolina. Think stereotypical delivery territory. Our summer activities were to be given a brick of .22 LR, and my brother, the neighbor girl, and I would take our three-wheelers down to the creek in the woods and shoot and play. I was 12 or 13 at the time. She has a very unique name, and I don't want to out her as I haven't seen her in years and don't want anyone embarrassed, was my age, and my brother was 10 or 11. Anyway, behind our houses was a large farm that was always farmed for fodder. Straw or hay. Every few years, he'd change it up and put in feeder corn. Now this field separates our land from the woods, as we called them. I have no idea who owned these woods, but they stretched north and east from our property. One side of these woods was thin, maybe 1/4 mile deep, and led to a subdivision, but the other leg of it ran forever. We never got to the end of that to see where it led. Anyway, this year the farmer had planted corn, and we asked him if it was okay to three-wheel along the periphery of his land to get to the woods. We had our 22s with us, I had a bolt action and S had a semi-auto. Of course, we were given permission, and we went to our usual spot. We parked, and we noticed some of the corn was damaged. There's no doubt deer are getting in there. We hiked into the woods, and something seemed off. S and my brother immediately said they wanted to go, but school was starting soon, and I wanted to play and shoot. They acquiesced, and we went into the woods, towards a little creek where we used to fish and try to trap turtles. As we approached this creek, maybe a 10 to 15 minute walk from the field, I stopped and asked, "Does anybody smell that?" It smelled like a dead animal, only worse. My brother said he was scared and wanted to go home. I agreed, and so did S, when we saw it. At first I thought it was a bear, but I had never seen one in our area before, just more north in Pigeon Forge. The bear was at the creek, scooping water up with his hands or into his mouth. We stood there dumbfounded when it looked at us, stood up, and looked like a big, shaggy, hairy person. I screamed, "Let's go!" And the three of us hightailed it out of there. We ran the best we could through those woods back to this three-wheeler. We didn't go back for a week. I eventually convinced my brother to go back, but we took our dogs with us this time. When we got back to the creek, they sniffed around, barked, and urinated a lot, but we couldn't find any evidence. We did tell our mom, and she told us to quit making up stories. I'm convinced to this day that we saw a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. My brother insists it was a bear on its hind legs, but at the time he was convinced too. Back in the 90s, a friend and I were spending the night at my family's hunting camp in the woods with my dad and a handful of others. My friend and I were drinking and walking in the woods that night. I think a bunch of us had driven to another camp that had a trail we had to walk down to get to from the parking area. We're just hanging out, and we see a tree that has fallen over, roots and all. We get closer, and the goddamned roots are glowing. Swear to God. We couldn't believe our eyes, so we broke some pieces off to keep and show our friends. They still glowed for the rest of the night, not super bright, but bright enough that you could clearly tell in the dark. We took those pieces home the next day and showed everyone, but, of course, they would not glow anymore. No one believed us, said we were drunk, etc. We were probably like 14 to 15, one of the first times we'd been drinking, I imagine, but we know what we saw and swore up and down that it was actually glowing. Hell, that was about 25 years ago, and I still know that we saw glowing tree roots that night. A couple years later I was reading a book for class, one of those books the whole class had to read. I think it was maybe Tom Sawyer or something similar, and in that book they talk about glowing trees or plants, foxfire, they called it. Something to do with the decaying process and phosphorus, etc., I believe. I quickly brought it to the attention of our friends and family, and while they were still skeptical, it helped reaffirm that we weren't actually slightly crazy. About 11 years ago, we moved into a very small old house across from a cemetery. The house was high on a hill with 2 large oak trees in the front, the driveway was in between the trees. One night I went out the front door to smoke. I stood up and turned to my right. Up against the tree, sitting was a slender body in a light baby blue old-style pantsuit. It's like in slow motion, as I look from the legs up to the torso, I see a fully grown German shepherd sitting to the right of the body up against the tree, and then I noticed the body or image does not have a head. The body and dog were facing the cemetery across the street. I freaked out. I started crying and screaming, trying to get into the house. My husband comes running up, asking what is wrong. I could barely make words form or come out. I literally stood behind him, tucked my head into his back, and pushed him towards the door to see. Nothing was there. I still get heart palpitations thinking about it. A few days later, we walked over to the cemetery. There was a headstone for a dog. The cemetery was very old. I was at summer camp once in the Pacific Northwest. Deep in the woods. Was a pretty isolated but still great camp. There was a winding trail that led away from the main property deeper into the woods, with small cabins that slept 6 sprinkled along the way, one by one. They weren't far apart, but they weren't right next to each other either. Sometimes you couldn't see the next ones because the path went around a few corners as it zigged and zagged around some big rocks and thicker groupings of trees and bush. One day I had to run back to my cabin alone to fetch something I'd forgotten. It could have been my swimsuit or a jacket, I don't really remember. All I know is that I left my cabin and turned left to walk down the path back towards the campground. I was walking along pretty absent-mindedly when I heard the sound of a twig or branch snap behind me. I knew I hadn't stepped on one. I glanced behind me and saw what appeared to be a large man-shaped thing entirely covered in hair or fur, about 30 feet away, just off the path, leaning from behind a tree. The idea of 10-year-old me seeing some kind of Bigfoot is something I don't even really believe myself. To this day, I don't like telling people what I saw. All I know is that I glanced back and became so utterly and immediately terrified that I bolted. I ran as fast as possible, straight down the path, back to where there were people. Camp counselors believed it could have been a bear, but they found no signs of anything after searching the area. It could have been a bear. It could have been a person. For all I know, it could have been my eyes playing tricks on me. I didn't get much more than a glance at it before running away. Like I said, I don't like to say I'm sure it was a Bigfoot type creature, but I also know what a bear looks like. I know what a person looks like. The fear I remember feeling in that moment, my instantaneous fight or flight reaction, was so over the top that it's hard for me to believe I wasn't reacting to seeing something crazy enough to warrant such an over-the-top reaction. Even if it happened too quickly for me to fully register what was happening consciously. I'll never know either way, but a small part of me genuinely feels that I saw something crazy that day. 3 years ago in February, I was up on Smith Mountain in Delta County, Colorado, with my yellow lab and my black lab. It was very cold, but there wasn't any snow anywhere. I had taken the dogs up on the mountain to chase rabbits, a favorite pastime of theirs. Anyway, we were on our way back down off the mountain, driving along in my Jeep at about half a mile per hour since we were in a very rocky area, and were on a trail. There was a cliff about 20 yards off to our left and then open terrain to our right, which ran over to the Gunnison River at the lower end of Black Canyon. As I was driving along, I had both back windows down and a dog hanging out of each one. I was trying to take some pictures when the camera battery died. Naturally. Suddenly, a Sasquatch or Bigfoot ran across the road directly in front of us. It was a very tall male. It crossed the trail and then stopped next to a 12-foot tall pinyon pine tree. It turned and looked directly at us, looking like it was dropping onto its left knee. No clue why? I turned around to make sure neither dog was exiting the Jeep to chase it, and when I turned back around, it was gone. I looked around but couldn't see it running anywhere, so it must have been hiding somewhere out of my line of sight. Other than how tall it appeared, what I mostly remember about it is that it was the exact same color as an Irish setter dog I used to raise them. The following year, I was out in a different area about 10 miles from that sighting and saw what appeared to be a mother Sasquatch walking along with a juvenile. When they saw us, they darted into a side canyon and out of sight. My camera was sitting on the passenger seat, not turned on. We continued, me and the 2 dogs, on our way, and about 2 miles further out on the trail, we stopped so the dogs could play. This was also in February, and it was about 5 degrees that day. I went down into a steep-sided canyon, about 30 deep, and was looking around as the dogs were elsewhere chasing rabbits. I came across what looked like a child's bare footprint in some damp sand. No parent in their right mind would let a kid run around barefoot in 5-degree weather. It had to have been the 2 squatches I saw earlier. When I was 5, I was playing in my backyard. The yard was long and ended with a fence and a gate. A laneway ran parallel to both. I remember looking up at one point and seeing 3 red balloons floating there, tied to strings, disappearing behind the fence. I was curious and started walking towards the balloons. But, suddenly, I felt a chill up my spine and experienced goosebumps for the first time in my life. I stopped halfway down the yard. Then a clown's head popped up and turned to look at me. It was white, bald, and had red hair on its sides. There was something deeply sinister about it. Like I was nothing more than prey to it. Nothing more than an insect. We stared at each other for what seemed like a long time. I was too scared to move. Rigid as a board. The clown smiled and vanished below the fence. The balloon stayed in place. I heard the latch on the back gate start to rattle. I ran into my house, scared, crying for my mom. She did not believe me but went out to look. I begged her not to. I cowered in the kitchen. It seemed like forever, but she came back. For a second, before she realized I was looking at her, I thought she seemed unsettled. But there were no balloons, and no one down the lane, she declared with a smile. She dismissed it as an overactive imagination. I had some nightmares about the experience for the next few weeks. My mom stayed up with me, trying to convince me it was my imagination. The nightmares and memory of the experience sank into my subconscious. Until years later, as adults, we watched the miniseries It as a Family. When I saw Pennywise, goosebumps ran up my spine. I was petrified and rigid as a board again. I looked over at my mom to tell her that this is what the clown looked like. She looked unsettled, and when our eyes met, I knew she had seen it too. I was driving with my best friend, his younger brother, and his older brother one Friday night. I live in North Georgia, so trees are pretty prevalent. But it was really dark that night, new moon, and the stars were pretty bright. However, once we came into a clearing just around the corner, his older brother noticed something. There was a strange orange glow that seemed to come from the sky. The next thing I heard was him yelling for me to stop the car. I looked up to see 4 very bright orbs hovering to form a square about 1,000 feet up. They were about 3 times the size of stars but 100 times as bright. I kept driving because I thought of all the stories where people stop and get abducted. However, my mind went to "You'll never see this again, might as well remember it." I stopped a few seconds later so we could get out. The orbs were silent and were not moving at all. He pulled out his phone, an old flip phone, to take a picture. As he did this, the orbs began to form a line perfectly in our direction. At this point, I began to panic. I was running towards my car when I looked back up at the sky. The farthest of the orbs had vanished. The next farthest also faded slowly away, followed by the next. The last orb stayed in the sky for about 5 more seconds before zipping off to the right and out of sight. Weirdest thing I've ever seen. However, I have 3 others who can testify that they've seen the same thing. I was probably 13 at the time. While ago. So basically, it was like at least 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'm laying in bed trying to go to sleep. Mind you, the hallway light is on and my door is wide open, so it's not dark or anything. However, I am the only person upstairs, and it's dead silence. I would have cut my TV off, but I got it taken away because I was leaving it on at night. Perfect. Anyway, some time goes by, and I'm facing my door when I stop. Out of nowhere, this slimy pink imp creature rushes to my doorway. Think of the creatures from The Descent, but entirely pink and almost covered in what looks like a thin layer of mucus or maybe blood. It just stares menacingly. It feels like it's been 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden this thing howls extremely loud. I can't even think of any animal that it sounded like. Like a cross between a siren and a black metal vocalist. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. No sound, and my jaw wouldn't even budge, straight paralyzed. After it's done screaming, it rushes back to wherever it was, and that's it. I guess it could have been a dream, but I swear I didn't wake up afterwards. I stayed up all night but eventually went to sleep at 8 in the morning because, duck that. I was 17 and driving home from my boyfriend's house around midnight. The road was dark with no lights except my car lights, and I couldn't see very far ahead. As I'm driving at about 40 miles per hour, I suddenly see a white girl about my age with dark brown hair appear in the dark, standing in the middle of my lane. I'm about 25 to 50 feet away from her. Instead of jumping out of the way, she puts her hands up in front of her face like she's bracing herself, waiting for me to hit her. I saw her just in time and was able to swerve and miss her, but as I look back, she's still just standing in the road. I was too shaken up to stop and see what her problem was, but I'll never forget that night. Last year I was driving to work. I work thirds, so it was already dark out. I was driving around 45 miles per hour until, right before I entered the next town, I saw a blue tinted light in the sky. It stayed in the same spot for about 7 seconds, so I figured it was a really bright star. I had to watch the road to make sure there weren't any deer because I had hit one a year prior. Anyway, when I looked back up at it, I saw it move up slightly. I was confused, So I looked around my car windows and the few houses, looking for a blue light that might be reflecting off my windscreen. I was in disbelief that it was moving the way it was. After I couldn't find anything it could be, I looked back up, and it took off in the night, making a slight curve. It was so high and fast that it was out of my view within seconds. It was too fast and mobile for an aircraft or a drone. I made sure to keep the memory of what I saw because it scared me, and I was thinking about it my whole shift. I don't know what I saw, but I did see it. Me and my sister thought it would be funny to make an Ouija board. We looked up a tutorial on Google on how to make one. I ripped all the pages out of an old composition notebook and started drawing. Once it was finished, we said some chant I can't remember and then started asking questions. Later that day, we did a few more funny spells. We wanted to summon Slender Man since that used to be trending and we didn't believe in any of that stuff. A few days later, we were walking to my neighbor's house at night. It's just a short trail, we didn't think anything of it. My sister followed behind me as we were walking, and I noticed I heard what sounded like something else crawling in the leaves. We have a lot of wildlife here, so I thought nothing of it and kept walking. When we reached the edge of my neighbor's yard, I turned to look behind me. I saw my sister, but there was something else behind her. This thing was so disfigured I couldn't tell what it was. It looked like a human somewhat, but it was crouched in the leaves, bent over, and its body was extremely skinny and pale. You would have thought it was someone in a Halloween costume, but this thing wasn't someone wearing a suit for sure. Its eyes were gigantic, and it just stared and didn't blink at all. As we ran away from it into my neighbor's yard, it shuffled through the leaves even faster. I honestly thought I was going to die. Thankfully, the neighbor's security light came on outside, and this thing wouldn't go into the light. A few days after that, it walked on the roof, pacing back and forth for hours one morning. It only walked on the part of the roof above the room we were in. Taking one step, waiting 3 seconds, and taking another. Even though this creature looked skinny, when it stepped, I heard the ceiling creak as if it were something big. Ever since then, this was 4 years ago, I still feel it watching me, and I haven't gone in the woods since. If it weren't for my sister being there and seeing it as well, I'd honestly think I was crazy. I had no idea if other people had similar experiences with this thing until I looked it up, and it appears to be called the rake. That's definitely what I saw in the woods that night. So when I was in high school, I was very into using a Ouija board a lot. I used it when I was alone and talked to something a lot. One evening I realized that I'd loaned a workbook to a friend and that I would need it for class before I'd see her the next day, and I was kind of panicked because the teacher was a hard ass. So I went on the board and asked where it was. It told me to wait. A minute or so later, it came back and said it was in the classroom, in the storage cubby like 5 from the door in the row above the bottom row, something very specific like that. It was a music classroom, and one wall was covered in square shelves similar to IKEA Kallax or Expedite for storing backpacks and instruments. The next day, when I went into class, it was exactly where I was told it would be. There was no reason I would have known that. I didn't even know my friend left it in the classroom, much less which of the 20 to 30 cubbies it would be left in. I'm a very, very skeptical person now as an adult, but sometimes I think of that, and it's really unnerving. The year was 1996. I was 12 and living in Duluth, Minnesota, in a somewhat rural area. I rode my bike to a friend's house who happened to live on an old tract of land that used to be owned by a cattle farmer. They had this massive field behind their house with these big rolling hills. One of these hills was actually an old cellar. We were never allowed on top of or to go in, for obvious reasons. It was old as sin and incredibly unstable. Well, those old, dilapidated wooden doors, I never saw them open, except on this night. It had gotten dark, and I hopped on my bike for the short ride home. As I was pedaling down the road adjacent to the field, I happened to glance over and thought I saw a man standing next to an open cellar door. As if he could feel my eyes on him, he snapped his head around to look at me. Normally, I would have thought, oh, my friend's dad must be doing whatever, but this man was wearing this huge, odd-looking hat, something his dad would have never worn. Well, after this brief staring contest, the man took one step in my direction and, creepiest thing ever, tried to wave me over to him. I managed a quick wave and pedaled off down the road. I turned around just before he would have gone out of view, and he was gone. I had to turn the corner and ride past a whole other side of the field lined with trees, and I remember just waiting for this strange man in the hat to lunge out at me from the shadows as I rode by. Longest bike ride of my life. I told my friend and his family the next day, and they all either brushed it off or didn't believe me. 2 of my buddies and I saw something unexplainable in one of those buddies' houses. It's an old house in the middle of my medium-sized, population, about 20,000, town in Iowa. Two instances of paranormal activity are still fresh in my mind. The first was in second grade or so. I was having a hard time sleeping on his bedroom floor when I heard the door shut. I looked up at it and saw it closed, but I figured it was a draft or the cat. I go back to trying to sleep. After a while, I hear the creak of a door opening. I look back at the door, and it is half open. Now I was pretty confused. I just sat looking at it like, how the duck did that get opened again? Then, right before my eyes, it starts moving back really slowly. I remember being totally frozen and just thinking, holy duck, this can't be real. But it was, and after it was completely closed again and a few minutes of me staring at it, the doorknob turned just so freakishly slowly, and it opened halfway again. It did this over and over. I was so scared, but eventually I had the courage to wake up my friend. It didn't stop, we both just watched it for a while, scared shitless. It did stop after a while, but holy duck, the thing was seriously moving by itself. A few years later, maybe, I don't remember how long ago this one was, me and that same kid in the same house plus another friend of ours were playing Gears of War in his living room. We were tossing pillows around, and one ended up behind the entertainment center, which we didn't bother to retrieve. A few hours later, it all of a sudden shoots out from behind it and lands on the ground. All three of us just saw it happen, and I remember getting intense chills going down my body. Like a shudder. It's just impossible. It shouldn't have happened, but somehow it did, and none of us knew what to do about it. We were just really upset and confused. I am still baffled to this day. I really don't tell the story very often because it just doesn't make sense. There is no way anyone would believe me. I've just come to accept that there are things in this world we just don't understand. Back in the late 1990s, I was living in a pretty bad neighborhood in Detroit. Directly across the street from the house I was living in was an old apartment complex that was burned out during the riots, according to people who lived in the neighborhood. I could never confirm this myself. At any rate, people are constantly going in and out of it. There are lots of addicts, gang members, drug dealers, prostitutes, and that sort of thing. The strangest part is that people avoided the basement. It's haunted. Stay out of it. It's haunted. Something is messed up in there. I'm a teenager, thinking I'll earn some points with my neighbors if I can show I have some balls. I volunteer to stay overnight in the basement. My life was not in a good place at the time, and I was making a lot of bad decisions. Before doing it, I decided I was going to make sure I was sober and well aware, in case I had to defend myself if someone tried to rob me. The week before, I didn't touch any mind-altering substances. It's October, crisp and cold enough that I can see my breath. I have on a thick Carhartt work jacket, a t-shirt, and an undershirt. I have a 4D cell mag light, so I can both see and have a weapon. I go into the basement, find an old milk crate, turn it upside down, and put it against the wall so I can see the stairwell in case someone decides to come down. I sit on the milk crate with my back against a flat, cinder block wall, just leaning there. I'm sitting there in the dark for a while when I see three pairs of amber lights, the color of a yellow stoplight, in the shape and spacing of eyes, moving in the shadows on the far wall, probably 50 feet away. I feel fear creeping in. There are no windows in the basement, so it couldn't have been reflections. I flick on the mag light and shine it across the room. In the middle of the room swims this giant black cloud of swirling smoke that is so dense that it blocks the light and seemingly pulls the light into it as I move the flashlight around. At this point, I am both scared and very, very confused. I start getting extremely hot, to the point where I'm sweating almost immediately. A few seconds pass, and I feel this sharp, searing pain down my back, a growl in my ear, and the words, "We've been waiting for you." I literally pissed my pants and ran out of the basement. I get back to my house. On my back are a trio of scratches that look like someone took 3 razor blades and dragged them down the length of my spine. My inner shirt was bloody, there was no damage to either the work jacket or other shirt. I have no idea what scratched my back. I used to have Polaroids of them. Now, there are some important caveats to all of this. I have bipolar disorder and was very mentally ill at the time. I was also taking a lot of drugs as a means of self-medication. I've tried relating the same story to other people before and always get the same thing. It was the mental illness, it was the drugs. Well, if it was, then it's the first and only time that I've ever experienced that kind of delusion and total detachment from reality that would have been necessary to see, feel, and experience what I felt. Drugs and mental illness also don't explain the numerous people who also believed that basement was haunted and actively avoided it. It also didn't explain the weeks of nightmares that followed, me being tortured and torturing my loved ones, or seeing amber eyes watching me from the windows when I would sit on the porch. I've only ever felt the way I did in that moment one other time in my life. It was pure terror, horrifying. It was like every fiber of my being was screaming at me that this is wrong, that this is not something I should be witnessing, and that this is not something I should be a part of. It was the first time I felt what I can only describe as genuine, deep evil. No light, nothing but pure malice. I felt that one other time in my life. I locked eyes with a guy across a bar, and it was like his eyes were dead of emotion. He smiled at me, and it felt so fake, so disingenuous. It felt more like a predator baring their teeth, like a shark, than a smile. I felt the same blast of discomfort and need to flee that I felt in that basement. I am fully aware that mental illness and drugs can do weird things to your brain. But both of these circumstances, the way I experienced them, have been total ducking anomalies in the decades that I've been dealing with them. And the second happened long after I quit doing drugs and achieved a great deal of mental stability. So yeah, for what it's worth, I believe you. After reading some of Lovecraft's works, I often wondered if he had a similar experience that inspired his work, where he caught glimpses of something he wasn't supposed to and blew that out into the mythos. I've read and researched a lot since then, and my basement experience has several characteristics of a demonic infestation and oppression. But through reading and research, I have stayed the duck away from anything that could put me in physical proximity to the paranormal. I don't know what it was, but I hope I never experience it again. When I was in middle school, there was this beast of a girl who bullied me constantly. Even dragged me around by my hair once. Obviously, I hated her, but I couldn't do much with teachers or parents around, plus I was smaller than her. Anyway, I got her back at school camp. We went to this place with an archery range and log cabins. That sort of shit. Archery was my thing, and I was pretty good. I stayed behind in the early evening to practice there by myself. The staff apparently trusted me enough. So I'm there by myself, and beast is walking alongside the range, spots me, and starts bellowing some racist shit at me. I tried to ignore her. I didn't think she'd come on the range while I was actively shooting stuff. She decided instead that hopping the fence was an excellent idea and told me she was going to beat my ass for ignoring her. At this point, she's maybe 100 meters away. I'm pretty pissed and scared at this point, but more angry because I'm sick of her shit. I still had an arrow knocked and told her, "I will ducking shoot you in the face, go away." But of course, the beast keeps charging. So I did shoot her and ended up taking off a chunk of her freaking ear. This scared the crap out of her enough that she ran off to dob me in, but nobody believed her. Butch never bothered me again. No one ever believes me.